Iraq GDP $264 billion. Finland GDP $280 billion. Czechia GDP $290 billion. Chile GDP $301 billion. Romania GDP $301 billion. Colombia GDP $343 billion. Hong Kong GDP $360 billion. Pakistan GDP $376 billion. Iran GDP $388 billion. Denmark GDP $395 billion. Philippines GDP $404 billion. South Africa GDP $405 billion. Malaysia GDP $406 billion. Vietnam GDP $408 billion. Bangladesh GDP $460 billion. Singapore GDP $466 billion. Austria GDP $471 billion. Egypt GDP $476 billion. Nigeria GDP $477 billion. Venezuela GDP $482 billion. Thailand GDP $495 billion. United Arab Emirates GDP $507 billion. Israel GDP $507 billion. Ireland GDP $529 billion. Cuba GDP $545 billion. Belgium GDP $578 billion. Norway GDP $579 billion. Sweden GDP $585 billion. Argentina GDP $632 billion. Poland GDP $688 billion. Switzerland GDP $807 billion. Turkey GDP $906 billion. Netherlands GDP $991 billion. Saudi Arabia GDP $1.1 trillion. Indonesia GDP $1.3 trillion. Spain GDP $1.4 trillion. Mexico GDP $1.4 trillion. South Korea GDP $1.6 trillion. Australia GDP $1.6 trillion. Brazil GDP $1.9 trillion. Italy GDP $2 trillion. Canada GDP $2.1 trillion. Russia GDP $2.2 trillion. France GDP $2.7 trillion. United Kingdom GDP $3 trillion. India GDP $3.3 trillion. Germany GDP $4 trillion. Japan GDP $4.2 trillion. China GDP $17.5 trillion. United States GDP $25.5 trillion.